Hi everyone and welcome back to Neuropsychology. So today we are going to start covering the chapter about emotion. And in this video we're going to talk about what is emotion, the components of emotion, Papin's theory, the contemporary view of the limbic system, which is very involved in emotion. We're going to talk about brain circuits of emotion, and specifically we're going to dive a little bit deeper into fear, the emotion fear. And then we are going to talk about the amygdala, Klüver-Bucy syndrome, the orbital frontal cortex, and the amygdala involvement in regret, and other structures of the limbic system. Okay, so neuropsychologists view emotion as a conscious, subjective feeling about a stimulus, so independent, aware of what the stimulus is. Emotion is the cognitive interpretation of this subjective feeling. So this is an inferred behavioral state called affect. So this means that affective behavior is internal and it is subjective. So most psychological theories rank emotions along two dimensions. So an example could be pleasant and unpleasant, and arousing and non-arousing. So here on the y-axis, you see arousing as you go towards the top, and you see not arousing as you go down. And on the x-axis, you see unpleasant as you go left, and pleasant as you go right. So, for example, fear, which you can see in the top left, it would be unpleasant and an aroused emotion. So, there are different components of emotion, and actually the experience of emotion has 4 principal behavioral components, and each can be quantified as well as observed. So these are the psychophysiology, the distinctive motor behavior, self-reported cognition, and your unconscious behavior. So let's start off with the first one, and then we go one by one down. So psychophysiological components include your central and autonomic nervous system activity and the resulting changes in your neural, hormonal, and visceral activity. So for example, emotion can change your heart rate, it can change your blood pressure, your distribution of blood flow, and also your perspiration and your digestive system. So for example, when you get really scared, if you see an alligator coming up to you, what happens, for example, is your heart starts beating faster. So this is because you get fear, you get scared. It can even change the release of hormones that may affect the brain or the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so next up is motor behavior. So facial expressions, tone of voice, and posture, they all express emotional states. So these motor behaviors are especially important to observing emotions because they convey overt actions that can differ from observed verbal behavior. So our perception of someone who says he's fine but is sobbing is different from our perception of the same person that is smiling. Okay, the third one is self-reported cognition. So cognitive processes are inferred from self-reports. Cognition operates in the realm of both subjective emotional feelings, so feeling love, hate, or feeling loved or hated, and also other cognitive processes such as plans, memories, and also your ideas. And the last one is unconscious behavior. So this component involved the cognitive processes of which we are not aware that influence behavior. So we may make decisions on the basis of intuition or a hunch or a gut feeling and other apparent unfounded basis. So a contemporary theory of emotion must include at least 4 of these principal behavioral components. So the theoretical distinction among physiology, movement, self-reports, and unconscious action is significant because researchers detect little correlation among these physical states of emotion when all of them are measured at the same time of participants. So we need them all together. Okay, the emotional brain. So in 1937, James Pepys proposed the first major theory of the neurobiology of emotion. So the structure of the limbic lobe forms the anatomical basis of emotion, he reasoned, and the limbic structures act on the hypothalamus and produce the emotional states. So, although for Pepys, the neocortex played no part in producing anything with emotion, so it didn't produce any emotional behavior, he did believe that the cortex is necessary to transform events that are produced by the limbic structures into our experience of emotion. So, this theory is very, very old, but it still had appeal during that time. So what it did was it combined behavioral phenomena having no known neurological substrates with anatomical structures having no known function. So it connected the two dots together. So the idea of an emotional brain gained instant broad approval because it wasn't known yet. So that an ancient deep part of our central nervous system controls emotion and how it sometimes does it unconsciously, together with the neocortex, it will produce consciousness, and this was a concept with natural appeal for the psychology of that time. So it's a very, very old view, but it was the first time when the limbic lobe was connected to emotion. So later, James Pepys identified the hippocampus and its connections with the hypothalamus. However, obviously, it's very old. Modern views of the limbic system focus as closely on the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and their involvement of the emotion. So here in the image, you can see the limbic lobe. So you can see the cingulate gyrus. Let me get my mouse. The cingulate gyrus all the way here at the top. You can see the hippocampus and the hippocampal formation, so the parahippocampal cortex. And you can see the amygdala, and then here the mammillary bodies and the mammillothalamic tract. So this goes from the mammillary bodies to the thalamus. And here you can see a part of the thalamus, which is the anterior part, the anterior nucleus of the dorsal thalamus. Okay. So here is another image of your limbic system, and on the right you see a very, very schematic image of the limbic system communication, or how these structures work together. So the hippocampus, amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, they all connect to the hypothalamus. And the mammillary nucleus of the hypothalamus then connects with the anterior thalamus, which in turn connects to the cingulate cortex. And then connections from the cingulate cortex will complete the circuit by connecting back to the hippocampus, amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. So what we just talked about is the connections on the right of this, but also right here, how everything projects. So the hippocampus projects, the amygdala projects, and the frontal cortex projects to the mammillary bodies or the hypothalamus. This goes through the thalamus to the cingulate cortex, and eventually this goes back and it closes the loop. So although this entire circuit is very important for behavior, including our hippocampus and the thalamus, the prefrontal cortex has been shown to be a key player. So within the prefrontal cortex, especially the orbital frontal cortex and the ventromedial regions. So we're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail later. And also the amygdala holds a key to understanding the nature of emotional experience. So the orbital frontal cortex is especially important in emotion because it represents positive and negative rewards, and you can learn which previously neutral stimuli is associated with a positive or negative reward, and when these associations change. So for example, if you get a choice between a left and a right button, and in the beginning they're both neutral because they're just buttons. But then if you find out that the right button gives you a piece of chocolate and you really like chocolate, then the right button gets a positive charge or a positive reward. So the MPFC, or the orbital frontal cortex, is really important for that. So here in the image, in the left image, you can see the orbital frontal cortex in blue. So it's all the way to the top and it's obviously bilateral, but in this picture it just shows on one side, so we can see the ventromedial prefrontal cortex on the other side. So why do you think it's called the orbital frontal cortex? Okay, so it's called this because it sits right above our orbits, and our orbits are the cavities in our skull in which our eyes are located. And on the medial side, you can see the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And of course the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex too, but we're not going to talk about that in much detail. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the amygdala. So the word amygdala is Greek for almond, and it is located in the temporal lobe, right in front of the hippocampus. So the amygdala has three main subdivisions. You have the cortical medial, the basolateral, and central areas. But you can cut the amygdala up in tiny little pieces. So just like the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala receives input from all sensory systems. So many amygdala cells are also multimodal. So some respond to visual or auditory or somatic, gustatory, and olfactory stimuli. And this is similar as how the prefrontal cortex does that. So therefore, the amygdala can create a complex image of our sensory world. It can combine all these sensory inputs. And this image is especially sensitive to stimuli that are threatening or dangerous. So bilateral damage of the amygdala renders an animal extremely tame and fearless. So it has a general lack of emotional responsiveness. It's very mellow and not scared of anything. So the amygdala appears to be part of a system that provides rapid and reliable identification of effectively significant stimuli, both pleasant and unpleasant, but it's particularly sensitive to threatening or scary stimuli. Okay, so let's talk about a syndrome. So the Klüver-Bucy syndrome is a behavioral syndrome, and it was rediscovered in 1939. The original syndrome was discovered earlier, but it was rediscovered in 1939 by Heinrich Klüver and Paul Bucy. And here there was a lack of affect, so a lack of emotional experience. So people with the Klüver-Bucy syndrome show no fear whatsoever of threatening stimuli, such as snakes or threat signals from humans or other animals. So this behavioral syndrome, induced experimentally from bilateral anterior temporal lobectomy in monkeys, include the following. So whenever the temporal lobe or the amygdala was taken out from monkeys on both sides, they had a tameness or loss of fear. They had indiscriminate dietary behavior, so they wanted to eat anything, or they were especially interested in foods that they previously did not like. They also have a increased sexual activity with inappropriate object choices. So, for example, sexual mounting of chairs. There's also There's also hypermetamorphosis, which is a tendency to attend and react to every single visual stimulus. And they also had a tendency to examine all objects by mouth. So that is the first thing you often see. So the Klüver-Bucy syndrome can also be observed in humans. And there was a patient in 1975 that had this, and he exhibited a flat affect, so no emotion, and engaged in oral exploration of all objects that he could grasp. So whenever he saw something, he would put it in his mouth to explore it. So he would, for example, put plastic wrappers from bread in his mouth, or cleaning paste, ink, dog food, and even feces. Ew. So the patient's sexual behavior was also a particular source of concern while in the hospital. He definitely did not act appropriate. And research has shown that the appearance of the Klüver-Bucy syndrome in humans and also in monkeys apparently requires that the amygdala and the inferior temporal cortex have to be removed bilaterally. So it's not just the amygdala, it's both the amygdala and the inferior temporal cortex. So monkeys with bilateral amygdalectomy, so whenever just the amygdala is taken out, they do not show the syndrome. So it has to be both the amygdala of both sides and both the inferior temporal cortex on both sides. Okay, so moving on to the feeling of regret. So researchers, Natalie Camille and her colleagues, so they presented healthy control participants and orbital frontal patients, so patients with lesions in their orbital frontal cortex, with a gambling task. So here both groups were asked to rate the emotional states after making a choice which would lead to either a win or a loss. So when participants learned that a choice led to a small win, but an alternative choice would have led to a larger win, they experienced strong negative emotion. Whereas learning that the alternative would have led to a large loss, they would have a feeling of relief. So after many trials, the participants began making choices that would optimize the most profitable outcomes. So this was largely to prevent feeling the regret of losing. So in contrast, patients that had orbital frontal lesions, they reported no regret, and they also did not adjust their behavior to minimize losses. So this states that if you have a lesion, you will not have the feeling of regret, and you will not be able to adjust your behavior for the most profitable outcomes. So the absence of regret in the orbital frontal patients suggests that they failed to grasp the concept of being responsible for one's own decisions. So later on, there was another research group, Coricelli and colleagues. They used fMRI to investigate brain activity and controls when they participated in a gambling task. And in the early stages, regret at choices was correlated with increased activity in the orbitofrontal and anterior cingulate cortex, and also in medial temporal regions. So you can see that image to the right. So as the participants began to make choices that reduced the probability of regret, it increased activity in the orbital frontal cortex and the amygdala preceding these choices. So this suggests that the same neural system mediates both the experience of regret and also the anticipation of regret. Okay, so we talked about the limbic system prior, so I know we talked about it in detail, but I just want to go over some other structures that are in the limbic system. Okay, so one of the structures is the hypothalamus. So here you can see the hypothalamus right here, and if you zoom it in, here you can see it right here. So what is the hypothalamus? So the hypothalamus is all the way in the middle of the brain. It is a deep brain structure made up of a number of nuclei. So you can divide it in all different types of nuclei. And what does it do? It integrates your emotional response, but it also regulates your endocrine system, your autonomic nervous system, and your sleep-wake cycle. So specifically, in your endocrine system, it is important for controlling oxytocin, which regulates social situations, and it also regulates vasopressin, which regulates your blood pressure. So it also regulates the peptides of love and fear, things that are included in breastfeeding and your blood pressure regulation. And then in your autonomic nervous system, it is involved in regulating your fight and flight and your rest and digest. So when is the sympathetic nervous system active versus when is the parasympathetic nervous system active. And then also it helps tell your body when it's time to go sleep and when it's time to wake up. Then we have the thalamus. So the thalamus in most books is said to be the relay system of the brain. However, that is not just simply true. The thalamus gets a lot of information from all over the brain. And then it has way less projections going out of the brain. So at some point, somewhere in the thalamus, it has to integrate all these signals that are incoming and then make decisions based on those signals and then send them out in a structured manner. So sensory and motor signals are sent to and from the spinal cord to the brain. So it gets information from the spinal cord and from the brain and also sends it back out. So our sensory information that goes into the thalamus can influence our emotion. And the thalamus, as I said before, it receives input from many, many regions. So one important thing I wanted to say is that the hippocampus and the MPFC do not have bidirectional communication. So the midline thalamus actually closes this loop of communication. And a lot of research is being done on that right now. Okay, we also have the cingulate cortex. So it's a little bit of blurry image, but the cingulate cortex is right above the corpus callosum. So don't get confused. They have the same shape, but the cingulate cortex is above the corpus callosum. So it's very important for regulating pain and emotion. And it drives our body's conscious response to unpleasant experience. So it helps understand avoidance of negative consequences. And what it also does is it regulates the net value of reward. So it's very important for reward processing. So it kind of calculates the benefits minus the costs and sees if it's worth it. So it's very important for decision making when you're exploring reward versus punishment. And that was the end of this video, and I will see you guys back soon for the next video.